It's time for our Around the World segment tonight. We turn to Iraq, to Mosul, where the battle to retake the city from the Islamic State terror group continues. ISIS has controlled Mosul for over 2 years, but Iraqi and coalition forces are making headway in the fight to retake the city. Take a look.
Bodies of Daesh terrorists are still at every corner, their slogans still on the walls. People are happy the Daesh siege has been broken.
We've been imprisoned for 2.5 years, and now the sun is shining upon us. We thank God the Iraqi army has liberated us.
On rooftops, locals raised white flags as Iraqi Premier Haidar al-Abadi had asked them to, in order to give security forces a lead that there are civilians inside. However, many still fear becoming a target of reprisal attacks by Daesh. They also told us off camera that they have many relatives in Daesh captivity and others who are living under the terror group's rule in neighboring Mosul.
Joining me now is former U.S. diplomat Jim Jatras. Jim, hi, how are you?
Hi, Liz. I'm great. Glad to be here again.
It's always great to see you. Jim, let me ask you, we see the updates that are happening in Mosul. We see the Iraqi coalition forces pushing towards the center. They're retaking what's essentially the suburbs of Mosul right now. But there are still many, perhaps even 1 million civilians that are residing in Mosul. And Jim, I guess my question, we're all sort of waiting for this humanitarian crisis to occur. We already see civilians being murdered, used as human shields, women and children being trotted out, used as pawns in this political war game. Why aren't these residents? Why aren't these civilians in Mosul? Why won't they leave the city?
In many cases, because they're not allowed to. They'll be killed if they try to do that. And it's strikingly similar to the situation in Syria with Aleppo and the Syrian army's offensive against Al-Qaeda, except on a much bigger scale. We're talking about 5 times the number of people that you have at stake in Aleppo. You also have a much more complex ethnic stew here in terms of the religious and national groups. You've got probably a large majority of Arab Sunnis in the city now. You've got a Shiite-led Iraqi army advancing on it, a Kurdish army advancing on it, Shiite militias, American air support. And there are a lot of people in that city that I'm sure really do not like ISIS at all, but they're not going to be really thrilled with their liberators either. So it's potentially a very big mess, and it's not going to be an easy campaign.
Right, so perhaps these civilians then, just to put it in plain English, feel that it's a lose-lose situation, or that they might have to choose between the lesser of two evils. I read a report earlier that said some civilians there, and this is a quote to media, to reporters, they said that if they're going to die, they'd prefer to stay in Mosul and die in their own homes than die in some displaced persons camp elsewhere.
And it's very understandable, and as I say, they may not have any choice in the matter anyway. It could be virtually a death sentence to try to get out of there under these circumstances, that ISIS is using people as human shields. They're killing people whom they suspect of essentially deserting the city that they hold. They're being utterly brutal about this. And I think most people, to the extent they can, they just hunker down, try not to get hit with bombs and shells or make themselves a target and hope for the best.
Right, and we saw when the Iraqi army was approaching Mosul, we saw ISIS deploy. They started burning sulfur, essentially, to create these big fumes, these black clouds to obscure the visibility for the Iraqi forces. It also resulted in a lot of civilians going to the hospital. But, Jim, there are reports that ISIS is stockpiling not only more sulfur, but more ammonia here. How do you expect this to be used? Is this for use on the civilians in order to create attention on the international stage, or is this still to try to fight back the Iraqi forces?
I don't think it's so much for attention on the international stage, because the reportage we see from Mosul about the hazard to civilians is very different than what we see in Aleppo. I don't think that will play for them. I don't think they can really gain much from that. They may use it as a weapon against the civilians themselves, as we've seen already. Or remember, they're also using a lot of suicide attacks against the offensive forces, and maybe they will incorporate essentially a chemical component to those kind of suicide tactics.
Right, and we're seeing them too. This is worth noting. I know you and I talked about this last week, but ISIS is using what they call cubs of the caliphate. These are child soldiers, sometimes child suicide bombers that are forced to go into places that an adult male wouldn't be allowed into, but a child wouldn't be noticed, to perform some of these attacks. But Jim, let me ask you about this. So Iraqi forces haven't been allowing U.S. forces to interrogate very many, if any, of the ISIS prisoners at this point. And I guess my question is why? If it is an international coalition, why aren't Iraqi forces allowing some interrogation from U.S. forces of those prisoners?
Well, this gets again to the very complex situation in Iraq and also of the Iraqi government. We have this rather uncomfortable symbiosis in Iraq, where the United States is supporting the Baghdad-based Iraqi government and its offensive against ISIS. So are the Iranians. And we are in this rather odd situation where we're de facto allies of Iran in this offensive. And I'm sure the people in Baghdad are looking at both sides. We have the American support and we have the Iranian support, and we have to make sure we steer a middle course between them, because eventually the Americans are going to go home, but the Iranians are not.
Right, and I guess that's put into play just a little bit now, when the Americans will go home now that we have a President-elect Trump. And Jim, that's where I want to go next. There are rumors that under a President Trump that the United States, boots on the ground even, will be back in the Middle East by next summer in order to defeat the Islamic State once and for all. Talk to me about that. What do you think of that?
I think there's a very small likelihood of that. Part of it may have to do with who he ends up appointing to his administration, and you already see a lot of tussle about who's going to be Secretary of State, Defense, and so forth. But I think Mr. Trump made it pretty clear with the campaign he does not want to repeat the mistakes of the Obama administration, or for that matter, of the Bush administration. No more regime changes, no more getting bogged down in ground wars, and frankly, I think he'd even be careful about the use of air power. I think he'll think more in terms of how we can cooperate with other countries. He's of course, especially talked about the Russians and Assad in Syria. And that's where I think, we can't have a strategy as we do under Obama where we fight the terrorists, the jihadists in Iraq, and support the jihadists in Syria. We've got to get on the same side of the page here. And I think Mr. Trump will try to do that.
Right, although I wouldn't lay any bets that he won't use air power, because that was one of his campaign promises, to bomb the hell out of ISIS. But I would bet within the next week or so we will know who that Secretary of State will be, whether it's John Bolton, whether it's Rudy Giuliani, whether it might even be Newt Gingrich. Jim, we'll have to save that for next week, but thanks so much for being here. Our next tipping point with Scott Greer is racism against white America. We'll be right back.